the hour. But
Perfect. Yep, perfect.
Well, hey, Mike, once again, thank you for being here with us. Most of the people that are inside this room with us are transitioning veterans that are part of the Career Skills Program out of Fort Drum. Rod has opened his company up to let us gain experience as interns, as cybersecurity engineers, cybersecurity analysts, project managers, Scrum masters, and we have one marketing intern. So we just came up with our top 10 questions to ask you, because personally, you're in the spot that I want to be in. So, and where some of us all want to be. We want to be that analyst, or we want to be that project manager over a team of analysts. So I'll go ahead and launch straight into this. This is usually like the top of anything we ask. How much basic advanced IT and cyber knowledge does a project manager really need to accomplish their job in cybersecurity?
Yes, yeah, great question. So the simple answer is you don't need any. if you really start off. But if you don't have some basic or advanced knowledge in IT or cyber, then it will slow you down, and it may cause you not to be able to get some of the better gigs, right? So some of the better jobs require you to have 2 years to 5 years of managing projects within that space, right? Whether it's IT or cyber. I think personally, taking the opportunity to be on projects where you can get an understanding of the general architecture, or get an understanding of how a technology works, it gives you better intuition. And a lot of what you do as a project manager is going to be based on your intuition. So being able to get an idea of what is needed for the project and be able to track those and make sure they happen. A lot of project management is really, if you think about it, it's really tactical planning and logistics, right? And so the more information that you have going into that, the better off you'll be able to help them plan and be successful.
With all your vast experience, which company is the best for a role as a PM in your experience?
So I think it's different whether you're starting off as a PM, or versus whether you have a lot of experience. So if you have a lot of experience, you can do well in almost any industry and almost any type of business. Some businesses are a little better as far as what they pay. Tech companies tend to pay a little bit more, including cloud-based like startups and companies. They usually tend to pay a little better. Companies that are in a city typically pay better, but that's not always the case. I think as far as the larger companies, I think it's easier to get swallowed up by them. So I personally, like when I was starting out, I didn't look for big companies. I looked for what I thought were steady companies, maybe companies that were a little more not on the bleeding edge of technology, but were a little more leading. So I started off, I worked for Avery Dennison. Stan Avery invented the sticker. So anything that looks like a sticker, acts like a sticker, he has the patent for. And so I got to meet him too, which was really cool. But that was kind of a low tech company that I worked for first, and then I went and I worked for Fujitsu in their telecom and photonics lab. And so I worked for them for about 7 years, and then I moved over into some more lucrative, like financial services, pays really well. So I worked for a startup, and then I worked for Merrill Lynch, and then I worked for Bank of America. So if you just take that kind of trajectory, I made a lot more money as I went in because I had more experience, and I targeted companies that would pay better. And if you're looking at pay, I would look at things like Glassdoor or Salary.com. Those would be the places I'd look to see what they're offering, and they'll even tell you based on your experience what companies are offering.
All right, well, that's some nice information. Thank you. So we're coming out of the pandemic posture, but there are still a lot of remote roles. how do you prepare to lead a team when you're in a remote project manager role?
Yeah, I saw that on your list, and I thought that's a really great question. I think three things. One is you have to recognize that as trustworthy as people you work with probably are, they also there's a lack of visibility. It's both you to them and them to you, and therefore there's probably a lack of communication. And so I think you really have to up your communication game when you're dealing with remote workers. Um, Same thing when if you're gonna make an assignment to somebody, you have to make sure that you follow up, that they understand what the assignment is and that they know what they're doing. Obviously, if they have a lot of experience, like if I'm working on a project and Rod's on the project, I don't have to follow up too often, right? But Rod might have to follow up with me, but 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 with that said, I think especially with anybody who's remote, you run the risk that they also might feel like they're not part of the team as much. So taking into account that you might have to have some meetings or activities that allow people to have like icebreakers, get to know each other, because I think the best time to do a little bit of socialization is when the team comes together or when you bring in somebody new in, but then having some repetition of that throughout the project to make sure that people are still working together and working well together and communicating the way they need to.
All right. Well, that actually covered the next question as well, because you went in and how to earn the trust with your team.
Well, the best way to earn the trust with a team, so there's one more thing you probably need to do, right? And that is you have to be trustworthy, right? And so you have to. So I would say it this way: you always want to be somewhat optimistic when you're putting together a project plan or something, or when you're working with a team. You want to be optimistic that you could potentially complete the goal, but you also have to be realistic, and so when you give your word, you want to make sure you stick with it, and that the team knows that you keep your word, and that they're expected to do the same. And I think that's really how you earn trust, is when they see that they shared something with you and you didn't spread it, or they shared a problem with you and you helped them take care of it. I think that's how you really earn trust with a team.
All righty. What are some of the challenges that a PM is going to deal with during a project?
Well, I'll just talk about a couple that have happened recently. We actually had a one of our project leads went on temporary disability, and so just out of nowhere, all of a sudden, when you build a project team, you have specific things that people are doing right on that team, and they have assignments, and all of a sudden, in the span of 48 hours, and Rod was on this project with me. Within 48 hours, that person was no longer going to be on the project, and and we wanted to support him as best we could. But then all of a sudden, it became evident, and we talked to him, and he said, "Yeah, I have to go take care of this medical issue. I can't be here." And so we had to then pivot, and as a team, we took on some of the responsibility, and then we brought somebody new in because we had to, right? And so we tried to fast track doing that. So I think that's one of the things, is you always have to account for the fact that somebody might win the lottery, good or bad. And if they do, how are you going to continue the mission without that key resource? Second one, and probably just as important or more important than maintaining your resources, is to manage expectations. So I think one of the biggest problems that you can or challenges that you can deal with on a project is when the team and the customer has very different expectations of what's going to get done. And this kind of feeds into a later one you had on scope and feature creep. If we document what we're going to do and we agree to that, that doesn't mean the customer is not going to come back and say, well, but what I really need is all this other stuff too. And so you have to be able to manage that. And, you have to manage it with the team, and you have to manage it with the customer. If the customer's expectation is just a millimeter off, you can probably absorb that and fix it. But if they're a mile off, you have to go back to them and tell them why that's not going to happen, and talk to them about what the difference is going to be. And that's sometimes a challenge because customers, they don't want to talk about the statement of work. They want to, statement of work really should be your rules of engagement, but sometimes they want to change them mid flight, and that becomes a problem too. So.
Well, most of us come from the military. We have our own ways of dealing with this next question that probably aren't going to have an equal within the civilian realm. When we in the military have an underperforming team member, we know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle an underperforming team member as a project manager, civilian world?
I probably should have asked Rod who all was going to see this before I answer this question, but I'm in favor of short sheeting somebody. You get them, you take them out to the hotel, and no, but I think, unfortunately that happens, right? Underperforming team members happen. And in the one problem you have is a lot of times they could be on your team, but they also could be a resource that's on somebody else's team that you rely on, so they might be a supporting role on your project and not report to you. Now, if they report to you, it's easy, right? You can have conversation with them, try to help them understand what they need to do to improve. You can put them on kind of an improvement plan. I think the first thing, whether they report correctly to you or not, the first thing you have to do is you have to set the goal. What's the goal of this project? And treat the project just like you would any other mission, right? What's the goal? What are our objectives? What do we have to do to get there? And make sure that team member understands what they need and that it's in writing what they need to do. If it happens in a meeting and it's not written down, they could argue they didn't understand it. But if it's in writing and they agreed they saw it and that they're going to do it, then it's on them. And then that's when we really might do like an improvement plan. For people that don't report,
much different than what we do in the military.
Yeah. For people that don't report to you, it's a little harder, right? If they're up a different command chain, then you have to start saying, okay. Well, one thing I always like to do as a project manager, by the way, is to make sure that I'm not just making relationships with the project team and with the customer, but I'm also working with those what I call a resource manager, right? So the people that are over the support staff, I'd like to build a relationship with them too. So if we do run into a problem, because it might not even be this person's problem, we might just run into a challenge as a team and we have to pull more hours of that person's time. And if I'm going to do that, I want to make sure I contact out to their management to let them know. So I'm not just pulling the resource, giving them the problem. I want to make sure that as a group, we kind of fix it together. And that's been pretty successful. I think I've only had a couple times in my career. So I've been doing this for 30 years. And I think I've only had a couple times where I had a resource manager that just said, nope, that's your problem. Usually, we're all all working for the same company. Usually they're willing to pitch in to help. They might not agree with the solution, and then you have to work that out too. But for an underperforming team member, I'd be very upfront with them, be pretty frank with them about what's expected. And if they just can't do it, or they won't do it, or it's just not going to work, then I would work to replace them on the project team.
What do you do what steps would you take if you have a project that's gone completely off the rails with scope creep and feature creep?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get it back on the rails? We'll just combine the next two. How do you get it back on the rails, and how do you avoid and deflect the creep?
Yeah. And I think it also helps with that demanding stakeholders part too, right? Because usually feature creep or scope creep comes from that, right? You usually have one demand. I remember we had this one project, and Rob was on this project too. I don't know how many of these meetings he was in, but we'd be in this thing where we'd have meetings before the big call, and everything seemed fine. And then we get on the big call, and somebody who had been in the other meetings showed up to the big call with a grenade and just basically threw it into the room and sat back and watched to see what happened to the project team, right? And it was always like when everybody was there. It was never on the side calls. It was always on the big calls. And and they were a stakeholder, right? This guy's signing the paychecks, so it's not like we could, avoid this person. But so a couple things that we do to try to get the projects back on track, and to also eliminate, scope and feature creep, is obviously you have to have a good relationship with your stakeholders, but as I mentioned, there's other people that you have to communicate with outside of your project team sometimes, that are either related to the stakeholder, or are related to a resource that you need. So if you need, for instance, the database team, well, I always like to make sure we have a good relationship with the person over the database team, so that if we have to reach out to them and say, hey, listen, I'm really sorry, but we're going to need more of your people's time. Here's this thing that came up that we realized is a challenge. I want to make sure that we have that. Same thing with the stakeholders and with their reports, because it's a lot easier to deal with a demanding stakeholder if their direct reports are on your side. So I usually don't have just a demanding stakeholder without having somebody from their team on our team. And so if we have somebody on the project that works for them, I'll work with them to make sure that we understand what their objections might be, what their reservations might be, and that we can address any issues that they might have as far as where the project is, either from maybe we are off track, maybe we're delayed. Delays are probably the biggest one that we usually see is, we think we're going to be done by the end of October, and all of a sudden we're sliding into Thanksgiving, right? And so that typically, when that happens, it's either we didn't recognize how long something was going to take and we estimated it wrong, or somebody asked for something different than what we thought, like, scope creep, a feature creep. Sometimes it's a red tape. And so we try to manage those by, working directly with those stakeholders and with the people that report to them. And typically that's the best way to get something back on track. The other thing we do to get a project back on track is to rebaseline it. So if the customer won't budge and they say, we need this extra feature that we didn't tell you about until the last minute, then we say, okay, then we're going to reschedule the entire project. We're going to look at the entire thing and give you a new estimate, but realize the new estimate's because you changed something, not because we didn't make it, but because you didn't change something and you want to change something. And so we're going to document that, and we're going to report that out to every stakeholder that this is the reason why we can't do this. And we've had projects where, like, I've had a project a couple years ago. We had a project where we were at a client, and they said, okay, it's a 3-month project, come in and help us. They extended us another year in order to implement it, because they decided that it was going to have to go through their change control process, and they didn't have any of the architecture documentation. They didn't have anything of the stuff they needed, and they had to build all that. And so they paid us while we waited. So
that's nice.
Well, it was good. I don't mean to sound like I was complaining about it, but what was bad was we never knew. We just never knew. Like, the whole time we were just sitting there going, okay, there's nothing to do. They're paying us, but then they come up with stuff for us to do that had, like, we're like, really, we're doing this? Why are we documenting this? This is crazy. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Because they were like, well, we're paying you, so we want to get some value out of this. And I'm like, well, it's not part of the project. So, but I think that is a problem that you just have to. And it takes a while to get comfortable to being able to deal with a demanding stakeholder and deal with changing expectations. But if you take nothing else away from this, is what it really comes down to is making sure you have a clear vision of what the goal is, understand what each of the objectives are that you have to hit in order to reach that goal, and make sure that they're all documented. And that if anybody comes back and they have something other than that, that you reflect that in your document, that you change the document to do that, and that they understand that changes possibly the resources you need, that changes the time, and it probably changes the cost.
All right, so I'm going to flip the order of these last two questions. In all of this, like, when you're going through a team that's having to when you're trying to get it, you might have to be getting it back on the rails, dealing with the creep, dealing with the stakeholders. What do you do to keep your team motivated through through the successes, through the failures, the hard times and the good? How do you keep them bought into it?
So the first thing that I always make sure is you never lie to them and try to make it sound better than it is. You know, like you can't go outside and look at a yard full of dandelions and go, there are no weeds, there are no weeds. They're still there. You know, it doesn't help. And so you have to, you know, same thing happens in projects, right? Sometimes you're working on this project and the client keeps saying this is going to be this most beautiful diamond, and you're looking at it and you go, no, this is a turd. And I'm like, no matter how I paint it, no matter what I do, it's going to be a turd. And so I think the biggest thing is within the team, you know, as a project manager, you don't get to go negative. You know, the team might go negative, but you can never go negative. You don't want to be false in being positive, but you want to be positive about the things you can be. And then again, it comes back to having a clear vision of what this project is and understanding, you know, maybe understanding what the value is to the stakeholders and being able to help the team realize how they're providing value to those stakeholders. You know, sometimes you get you get like this goal for a project, and you get a goal for the project, and it's just not achievable. And in the end, they pull the plug and they say, you know, yeah, we wasted $50,000, but we're just not going to do this project, or we wasted $500,000. We're not doing this project. We're just going to can it. And the project team usually feels pretty bad about that. And the reality is it's up to the stakeholders to make the decision where they are going to invest. And sometimes what they ask you to do is impossible. And if it's impossible, you know, being able to call that earlier than later is usually better for the team. In addition, you've got different. A lot of times the teams are comprised of different people. You know, it's not very often that you end up with all the same people, project to project to project. It can happen, especially if you're doing Scrum. A lot of times, like Scrum development teams stay together, but you know, a lot of the stuff I work on are more pod-oriented teams where we're pulling in people from several areas of the business together onto a team. And so you may work with somebody and then not see them again for 2 years, and then you work on another project with them. And in those cases, you know, you want to make sure that you keep those focus on the relationships as much as you do the work, because you know, the work will end one day, but hopefully the relationships stay on, and then you're able to motivate each other. Because as a PM, you're just as limited as everybody else on the team to motivate, positive or negative, the team. So.
All right. What, in your opinion, can I do to truly stand out as a PM at an organization? And what can I do when I'm interviewing for these project manager roles to stand out?
Okay. Yeah, I think so I gave this one some thought. So I read these ahead of time because I wanted to make sure I had some answers that made sense and I didn't just ramble. I probably still rambled, but at least I had thought them through a little bit. I think I'll start with what you can do in an organization, and I'll roll back to the interview process because I think that one's a little harder. When you're already in an organization, in addition to building relationships with people, I think which by far makes you stand out. Because if you can get on a call and somebody says, "Oh, we're having this problem," you say, "Let me contact them. I'll come back to you. I'll talk to you this afternoon," and you come back with fixing the problem. Boy, that makes you invaluable, right? At that point, they just need you. I think that's one thing that really helps. I think another thing that really helps is being able to report back the status of something and being able to challenge where we are. Like, so for instance, if there's a problem coming up and you see it, if you get in front of it and you're able to notify the stakeholders ahead of time, hey, I see this, I think this is going to be a problem. How do we want to handle this? That'll also make you very, very valuable, because a lot of the project managers that I've seen that I've worked with project managers at various companies, and the ones that do really well are proactive about getting in front of problems. The ones that don't do so well are the ones that wait until Friday and then they call you to go, hey, how'd you do on that? Okay. And then they type up a status report and send it out to everybody, and they're not really engaged, so being engaged in your projects, I think, is a huge win. Gaining some intuition, as we started in the beginning of when we were first talking, gaining some intuition about the space that you're working in. So if you're working in IT or you're working in cyber, understand what the technology does and how it works a little bit, so that you can get in front of some of those challenges or problems that might come up. I think I think all of those are really good, because people don't want you just to come with problems, or they don't, and they like when you come with solutions. But if you come before it's a problem, that's even better. That's the best, I think. During the interview process, I'd say a couple things. One is, don't oversell what you can do, but don't sell yourself short either. Kind of try to. I would do the sniff test. Like when you go and interview yourself, or when you interview each other, if it smells like it's BS, it probably is. So don't do that. But definitely. But another thing, if you're asked a question and you don't like the answer you had to give, then in between interviews, I would be working toward figuring out how to come up with a better answer, or how to get the skill that I don't have. Like if somebody asks me, hey, well, have you ever used, this type of tool? And, have you ever used Asana? Well, I've never used Asana. Now, so I might go, wow, I don't know if that's really important. But then I go to a second interview, they also ask about it. I'm like, okay, well, now I should go look at that. If I don't have that experience, now I want that experience. Well, can I get a free version of it? Can I start playing with it? What can I do? I think that's really useful. There's a number of tools out there, project management tools that you can use. Jira is probably one of the biggest ones that I see that the most everywhere. Especially if people are doing agile. A lot of people use Jira. Microsoft Project is still pretty well ingrained in a lot of the bigger companies that I work with. So that's another good one to have in your wheelhouse as well. But that's what I would do in an interview process. I would also make sure that before I met with them, that I had some idea of what their company is doing, not just what their company does, but what they're doing. Like I'd be looking for them in the news to see, do they have any press releases of things that they're doing, things they're building, new products that are coming out, services that they offer. I would be looking at stuff like that, because if you go into an interview and you know what they do, and you're able to speak in context of what they need, you're going to stand out above everybody else, because people just don't go that far. And the last mile is it's empty freeway, right? Everybody else stops short. They don't go to the last mile. But if you do, there's nobody else there. You'll stand out completely, and in a good way. So.
All right. Well, do we have any questions from the audience members that have come up that we didn't get put on the paper?
Yeah, I have a question.
Hey, Shane.
Yeah, go ahead, Shane.
Hi, I'm Shane Warren. I'm a transitioning intelligence officer trying to get into project management. So a question that I kind of had that you kind of hit on earlier a little bit was kind of the difference between maybe being more of a freelance project manager running from smaller company to smaller company versus being, as you said, swallowed up by a larger organization. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little more on that and what the two look like and why you prefer one or the other?
Sure. Yeah. So and when I said swallowed up, I was really talking about when you're first starting out, right? Because I think, everybody has a preference when you get into doing it. You've been doing it in your career for a few years. You'll find that you have a preference, right? So for some people, working with the same team, like I'll give you an example. If you wanted to be a Scrum Master, let's say, I think tech teams or more technology organizations are more likely to offer that as an option. And if you took that on, odds are you'd be working with the same people frequently, right? Because usually with a Scrum team, you have the same development team. They keep the Scrum team together for the most part. If you wanted to, if you end up in a bigger organization, the reason I say you get swallowed up is if you come in as a junior project manager, it may take a long time for you to become a senior project manager there, right? Just because the company's so big, and you'll get indoctrinated in the way they do project management. Whereas in some of the smaller companies, you'll get a chance to explore a little bit more. And I think starting out, that might be better because you'll get to touch technology and techniques that you might not get if you just come into a bigger company up front.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's pretty much just like different ways to control your career trajectory. Because I do I spent some time in the corporate world, and I do agree that it is a little slow with the progression.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, but I mean, the other thing to remember is, if anywhere that you can take your military experience and utilize some of the things that odds are you might not be able to tell them what you did, but if you have skills that you learned that you can transition or transfer to what their needs are, and you can show that you're doing that, I think you'll move up a lot quicker. So I would imagine that even if you went to a larger company, odds are you wouldn't get swallowed up, right? It's just somebody with military experience, somebody, I remember we were talking about when we would hire people that had their Eagle, like an Eagle Scout. We always wanted to interview them because it was always interesting to see they typically had more leadership capability than their peers, right? Same thing goes with military, right? If somebody has military experience, I'm more interested to interview them because I know that they understand command and control, right? And a lot of people coming out of college, I think in colleges they typically teach you the exact opposite of command and control, right? So just my thought on that. So.
Well, I got another question for you, Mike.
Sure.
You've mentioned Scrum a couple of times, and I know that PMI has finally, with PMBOK 7th edition, is finally starting to break away from waterfall and move into Scrum and Agile. How important is how important is it for a project manager just to go ahead and go get his PSM or Safe Scrum or something like that?
Yeah. So I took it a couple different ways, right? And I got to do it over time, right? So I got my PMI first. I think that was back in 2003. I was certified as a PMP, and then I learned Agile on the job when I worked for my first startup. They were doing a huge project. I'll give you an idea. The project was nicknamed K2. And the deal was if you lived through the project, that it was like you climbed K2, and it felt like it. But in that one, I got experience leading a team, being a Scrum Master and leading a team. I went and got that certification separately, though. I went to the International Scrum Institute. It was one of the few at the time that you could just go and study it, take the test, and get certified. So I certified as both that and a product owner. But if you get the chance to do that all as part of PMI, I think that's good too. My only concern with PMI is that I feel like they're kind of slow to change. And so, so for waterfall and agile, I think they're good now. But I'll give you an example. I studied with Eli Goldratt. He's an Israeli physicist. Came up with a thing called the theory of constraints, which are now part of PMI, but they weren't. And so I was probably about 15 years ahead of PMI in my study of theory of constraints. And they had no way to certify that. So, I would just say, I would look at multiple ways of certifying, and it depends what kind of job you want to get. I think if you want to do agile, if I was doing it today, I probably would go and get my agile certification first, and then do PMI, because I think PMI would take a little longer. Like, you can be agile certified probably in the course of like 2 or 3 months, and PMI can take you, if you really study it, it probably takes you closer to 6 months to a year, especially if you don't have a lot of project management experience.
The one thing that veterans do have going for them, we have something from Syracuse University called Onward Opportunity, and it will allow us to go get our PMP or our CISSP, things like that, with
Fantastic.
a co-group. You brought up constraints, the theory of constraints. I actually was reading a book, Project Phoenix, the Parts Unlimited, the book about Parts Unlimited. And they were talking about the theory of constraints and resources. And going back to what you said about, hey, you might have a resource that's not yours, and now this resource has become a constraint. What are more ways, like if they just say, no, you can't, you're at a constraint. How do you navigate through that, through like that?
All right, I'm going to teach something, and if you guys get bored, just poke your neighbor if they fall asleep. But there's a really quick, easy way to deal with that constraint issue, especially if it's, and you can use it to people that are internal to your team. You can use it for yourself if you need to. You can use it for other people. It's called communication buffer. And what it is I have to put a period of time in front of anything that I want somebody to do, which is when I tell them. You know when somebody would say, hey, in 5 minutes, I need this. Well, that's not enough time for everybody, right? So, that might work. That might work in certain areas, but it doesn't necessarily work, especially in business. You don't know when somebody's going to be out or not. So for every task that I put into there, if I know I need a resource that's going to take a little longer than that, I build in a buffer of time. So I'm like, I need to notify Jim today because next Monday, I need him on this, and he needs to work on it for 3 days. So I'm going to reach out to him, right? There might be another person. There's this guy, Shankar, we're working with. If I'm trying to get a hold of him, I need 2 weeks because he's a vice president. And if I'm reaching out to him, he's traveling. So, but I need to be aware of that. And if I'm mindful of that, then they appreciate that I'm not coming to them last minute asking for something. Rather, I'm reaching out to them to let them know about something that's coming up and asking for their help. You get a better result as part of that. So, but that's called communication buffer. I learned that in the theory of constraints. That was one of the ways, because all that theory teaches you is that there are constraints. There's things you can or can't do in a system, and you figure out what those are using intuition to figure out what those are, and then you apply some tools to be able to be more successful. And so communication buffer is a big one for me. I think if there was one tool that I use that most project managers don't even know exists, it's that one. So
yeah, they actually, I believe the character in that book, Eric, who was like the voice of intuition, did talk about communications buffer. I got that book. Rod's brother Rob recommended that book to me. It was really, really good read.
That's cool.
Well, I see we've gone over on our time a little bit. Does anybody else have any other questions for Mike? Going once, going twice, gold. Well, Mike, once again, I want to say thank you. This was really, really good for me, for Shane, for any of the interns that might be trying to get that peek into project manager, and then for down the road as we bring on more interns into the company trying to exit the military, because most non-commissioned officers and the junior officers that we get, they do have a good leadership background. And I keep saying everything that we did as a leader in the Army was project management. And what you just told us today, be trustworthy, communicate, plan. That's everything we've been trained to do.
That's it.
All right. Well, sir, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Nice to meet you all.
All right. Now I'm going to stop.